welcome to the Equity Conclave. My name is Dr. Vanessa McPhail, and I am the Community Affairs Specialist in Diversity, Equity, and Poverty. Today, I will talk to you about the Racial Equity Analysis Protocol, also known as the REAP. So, first, let's begin with what is the REAP. The REAP is an instrument to be used when school leadership is making decisions that impact students. The expectation is that this protocol is used for every school-based decision. Who uses the REAP? This instrument is constructed to uncover exclusionary practices, but requires multiple perspectives. For the best results, a diverse group of school-based stakeholders should always be included. When is the REAP used? The REAP is not just for new ideas and initiatives. Schools are expected to screen established practices using the protocol as well. Teachers are also encouraged to utilize the REAP for classroom decisions. There are 8 questions to the REAP, which we will get to later. And lastly, how does this tool add to racial equity? Utilization of the REAP leads to more equitable decision-making for policies, practices, and procedures, especially because if any established practice proves to marginalize any student group, school leadership is expected to amend or end the practice. In 2018, the racial equity policy was passed unanimously by the Jefferson County Board of Education. The policy clearly aligns with 2 of the 3 district pillars: culture and climate, and racial equity. The racial equity policy calls for more equitable, systematic practices and policies that address inequities. The Racial Equity Analysis Protocol serves multiple purposes. Number 1, it helps to promote racially inclusive collaboration, helps to expand opportunities for students of color, impacts systematic change, allows leadership to make informed decisions, and it allows us to change systems. Dr. Marshall likes to refer to ensuring that the REAP is fibrous by dedicating time to use the tool. The REAP is not something that should be an afterthought. It is something that should be a part of just what we do on a regular, consistent basis. The REAP can also evoke needed conversations about race. We have some examples of when to use the REAP. The REAP can be used during SBDM meetings.
Hello, John Marshall, Chief Equity Officer for Jefferson County Public Schools. I'm here to talk to you today about the racial equity policy. More importantly, a tool that was born from the policy called the Racial Equity Analysis Protocol, also known as the REAP. The REAP is a list of questions that we are requiring our SBDMs to use as they make decisions around practices and policies for schools. The purpose of this tool, the purpose of the REAP, is to make sure that as you are making decisions for our students and our families, we have no unintended consequences that disproportionately impact our students of color. So when you go through these questions, you are to be introspective. You are to make sure that the decisions you make inform, include, and lift up our students of color, if you will. It is 8 questions. Please use them effectively and make sure that as you use them, we keep our students and achievement in mind. This was born out of the racial equity policy that the board approved months ago. This policy says that Jefferson County Public Schools must do more for our students of color. The Racial Equity Analysis Protocol is one of those tools that we believe, when used effectively and as required by you all to use, that it will improve outcomes for students because it gets away from unintended consequences. It puts us in a place where we have considered all thoughts and we are addressing all students to be more inclusive. So again, please use the Racial Equity Analysis Protocol, also known as the REAP, and make sure that as you're making these decisions, you are introspective, not just for yourself, but for the well-being of our students, particularly our students of color. Thank you for all that you do. We appreciate you.
It can be used during instructional leadership team meetings. It can also be used in whole staff faculty meetings. The next list I share with you some samples of common practices in schools where items can be filtered through the REAP. I won't read them all to you, but I'll point out a few. Students receive quote unquote lunch bunch if they turn in their homework for the week and have good behavior. Student recognitions. And then another possible one is widespread classroom management procedures, such as a color chart or class dojo. Those are just a few examples of common practices in schools that can be filtered through the REAP. Now we are going to go over the 8 questions that are on the actual REAP. Question number 1. What is the overarching purpose of the proposal or initiative? That one is very straightforward. Question 2. Is the initiative or policy resourced to guarantee full implementation and monitoring? And when we talk about resourced, of course, we're talking about financial resources, but resources can also be people, personnel, staff. So just keep that in mind when we talk about question number 2. Question 3, which racial/ethnic group could be inequitably affected by this policy and how? So the first thing I want to point out is in question number 3, there are 2 parts to the questions. So which racial group could be inequitably affected, and then how. And when we talk about racial and ethnic groups, we have to be sure to identify those racial and ethnic groups, such as Hispanic, American Indian, Alaska, Native, Asian, Black, African American, Native, Hawaiian, Pacific Islander, and white. Question number 4, similar to 3, but not the same. Which racial or ethnic group will have the most concerns with this proposal or initiative, and why? Again, this is a 2-part question, and we have to identify the racial or ethnic group that has the most concerns and explain the why. The group that has the most concerns may not be the same group as the group that could be inequitably affected by the policy. Question number 5. What unintended consequences could result from the policy, racial inequities or otherwise? And the key to question 5 is the unintended consequences. Question 6. Have stakeholders, particularly those most impacted by this decision, been meaningfully informed or involved in the discussion of the proposal? How did the process go, and what was the feedback? As you can see here, this question has multiple questions, so we want to be sure to address all of them. And of course, the key here is stakeholders, but the other part of it is how did the process go and what was the feedback? Question 7. What factors may be producing and perpetuating racial inequities associated with this issue? Does this policy or initiative deepen these inequities or improve them? Again, a 2-part question. And the factors, it really just depends on the policy that you're filtering through the REAP in order to be able to identify the factors that may be producing and perpetuating the racial inequities. Question 8, who? Is it an individual or is it a department team? Is the main driver for improving racial equity for this particular proposal/initiative? For example, the principal or SBDM or a particular department. It just depends. Lastly, we want to get into the next step questions. And the next step questions come after we have filtered the item through the REAP. After using the REAP for this particular policy and or practice, should it move forward? That's a dichotomous question. Yes or no? If yes, what changes will you make in making sure that the policy is more inclusive? And then lastly, what is the deadline for the changes when they need to be made? So when filtering the policy or practice through the REAP, there are a couple things that you should keep in mind. To begin with, Make sure you answer all of the questions. Don't leave any questions blank. Explicitly state the race and ethnicity. Again, the specific race needs to be stated. Things such as ECE, ELL, SES, at risk, marginalized, things of that nature. Those are not races. We have to explicitly state the race. Third, critically and thoughtfully answer the questions. So it's going to take time, and you have to be sure that we are thoughtfully answering the questions. And lastly, use your data and the equity scorecard to check for inequities. The data can be suspension data, attendance data, comprehensive school survey data. It just depends on the particular policy or practice that you're filtering through the REAP as to which data will be needed. Next, I want to share with you some resources that we have to help you filter items through the REAP. So Dr. Chang in the data department came up with a document that's called the Best Practice Guideline for REAPs. And it highlights a couple things. Number one, that the REAP should always be done with a team. You need to assign a facilitator. You need to have data. It does require dialogue. We want to encourage dialogue, and then the follow-up. So this is a great tool to have in preparation when you're going to filter something through the REAP. And when we talk about team membership, multiple perspectives are valuable. It is encouraged that REAPs are implemented by a team of at least 3 people, at least 3. And again, we want to try to make sure that that group is a group that is representative of your school's demographics and that that group is diverse. Number 2, assign a facilitator. A facilitator is helpful to the process. This individual is responsible for gathering necessary materials ahead of time, which should include the REAP questions and a written procedure, policy, or practice for the team to review ahead of time. Step 3, using data if applicable. Whenever possible, team members and/or the facilitator should be utilizing data to support the REAP responses. It is essential that assumptions do not drive the REAP reviews and that responses are supported by data or research when it is appropriate. We want to avoid saying things like I think or we believe. We want to have data to support our reasons. Number 4, encourage dialogue. In some cases, REAPs may be conducted virtually through a shared document. In most cases, REAPs that encourage dialogue are most effective. Inclusive perspectives and courageous conversations promote the spirit of a high quality REAP. And lastly, we have to agree on follow-up. Depending on the next steps of the REAP, the team members may want to develop a plan on how to follow up on identified areas of improvement. Another useful document that we use in central office is a document that connects certain practices to the tenets in the racial equity policy. Remember, the tenets are curriculum, instruction, and assessment, culture and climate, programmatic access, staffing and classroom diversity, and then central office commitment. So for example, the decision directly impacts students' learning or teachers' teaching. Well, this directly connects to Tenet 1, curriculum, instruction, and assessment. Another example might be, let's take a look at systematic changes impact school or student assignment, student choice, diversity, and student access. That's a central office commitment. And then lastly, an example regarding professional development, making decisions on improving and addressing racial equity via professional training. This ties directly to Tenet 2, culture and climate. So this is another useful document when filtering things through the REAP and being intentional about connecting them to the racial equity policy tenets. A couple couple things to think about as you prepare for the upcoming school year. We have come up with some what we call REAP reflection questions. There are 5 of them. Number 1, what is the process of filtering policies or practices through the REAP at your school? Is it something that happens on a regular at faculty meetings? Is it done in PLCs? Is it done regularly on SBDM? But what does that process look like at your school? What policies or practices will you filter through the REAP in the 2021-22 school year? So have you identified or made a list of those policies or practices to filter through the REAP and then prioritize them? Question 3, how are you building capacity to empower more people in your school to initiate filtering items through the REAP? So the only people that filter items through the REAP should not be administrators. We want to empower everyone in the school building to feel as though they are able to filter items through the REAP. Question 4, what is your biggest hurdle in making the REAP fibrous at your school? Have you identified those hurdles? Are you seeking solutions to try to mitigate those hurdles? This will help to move the work in regards to the REAP. And lastly, question number 5, how has using the REAP strengthened your school? A great reflection question to help move the work forward. Next, I just want to give a little overview in regards to things that have been done with the REAP. So at the school level, last year, each of you were given a Google folder, and that is where you were to place all of the REAP so that they were in one designated place. In 2019, there were 5 policies that were filtered through the REAP per the superintendent's guidance: dress code, discipline, homework, protection of instructional time, assignment of students to classes, and programs. And those were the 5 policies that were filtered through the REAP. And then last year, 2020, each school had to filter their school's mascot through the REAP. At the district level, we have a district REAP committee, which I lead, and we meet once a month. It is the basically the number 2s of every division, and we come together. The purpose of the district REAP committee is to ensure that the REAP becomes fibrous throughout JCPS. And we also have created a dashboard where we're able to look at the REAPs in central office, the impact, the numbers, and various factors that have been pulled from the REAP document that make up the dashboard. You all are going to authentically filter this gifted and talented plan through the REAP. Any questions before we get started? All right, I'm gonna turn it over to LeBron.
Okay, so last year we took the district gifted and talented policy through the REAP, but now schools are required to come up with their own gifted plan per school, which will be going into effect for the 2020-21 school year. So this is one school's plan that has already turned one in that we are going to look at. And then there's responses in here, but definitely if you see something that we need to add or to subtract, to chime in and do that. So the purpose of this plan is to have multiple methods of identifying students for gifted and talented, and also having multiple services that are available. So if we look at this school's plan, the state regulation requires that a minimum of 3 pieces of evidence are considered when identifying a student as gifted. And their committee will work together with school personnel to determine acceptable sources of evidence. So if we look at the plan that they have laid out, they've identified teacher recommendations and nominations. They're going to use gifted student behavior checklist. They're going to use the COGAT test, MAP scores, and then jot downs, which are observational forms. So if we look at the REAP and we start with number 1, what is the overarching purpose of this initiative or policy? So they are directed by state law that they are supposed to have a plan. So that is the purpose. And then it says, is the initiative or policy resourced to guarantee full implementation? The policy is currently resourced by the staff at the school. Number 3, what racial ethnic groups could be inequitably affected by this policy and how? So we know that students from underrepresented populations, minority students, ESL, ECE, and low SES students could be affected, but they don't have listed how. So would anyone want to give a reason of how that could happen?
Identification methods can be subjective because of lack of understanding what types of giftedness students could possibly be, and not penalizing students because they don't fit just an academic type of giftedness.
Correct. Those also stood out to me because there could be some implicit bias there with certain students, certain types of students.
And behaviors.
Also, Florence, isn't the COGAT flaw, isn't it? I was always told that the target of the COGAT are white, male, upper middle class, that's the group that usually tends to be more successful, just the way that the test is designed.
There's still discussion on that point. I wouldn't go that far to say it's completely flawed. There is bias in tests for sure. So I think that is something the district's been working on. There's a committee, I think, that's been looking at different tests. So I think that's why you'll see something newer is the MAP scores are being added as additional tests. But I think there's still even discussion about having another test on top of these 2 that are listed. So I think that's probably, I mean, I see it mentioned later, but in terms of, there's really only 2 tests right now in this list, COGAT and the MAP. So I think there's, maybe an opportunity to find another test besides those 2 that the schools might, be exploring.
Yes.
But I like that we're including the MAP now,
Correct.
because one test on one day. If you're sick that day, it can make a difference in whether or not you qualify.
And the district, like she did say, we do have some pilot tests running to see if we can see a significant difference with our underrepresented populations. Okay, number 4 says, what racial or ethnic group will have the most concerns with this proposal or initiative and why? And then based on the data that we currently have as a district, we know that our students of color and our low SES students will definitely would be affected because they are currently still underrepresented in our gifted programs.
Why wouldn't all the ones listed in 3 be included in 4?
Based on the data, those 2 are the most significant, but they would all be included. Okay. I do agree. Of the ones listed above.
Here's where our departments, the top part of the dashboard is the same as what you see before. Our different departments can actually click on, so IT can click on IT on this page and it will change everything on the page to be IT specific. So that's how we built it, is for department leads to be able to look at their REAPs and the alignment to the policy. But this, what you're seeing, is a district view. So we code each REAP for its alignment to the tenets and the directives. And so you'll see here the majority of the REAPs have been related to curriculum, instruction. This is cut off, by the way, because these are screenshots. So if Dr. Marshall's okay with it, we can provide the dashboard to people to look at. At this point, it's been an internal dashboard for department heads. And then, okay, so that's the directive, alignment to the directives. And then we have alignment to the action steps that are outlined in the policy. So you'll see the majority is involving supporting instructional practices with, surprisingly, not as many in terms of reducing disproportionality and discipline, as we know that's something that we talk about a lot at the district. So again, this is looking at how the REAP topics were aligned to the directives for us to focus and improve as we continue to do these. Then the last page is involving impact, because people always want to know what's the impact. This is right now potential impact is what we will call this. We're in a year that is kind of a data challenged year because of COVID, but what we did was we coded each REAP topic, and we looked at two things. We looked at the scope of how many schools it would cover. So remember, it could be a REAP might cover an initiative that is like a pilot for 3 schools, or it might be something district-wide, or it might be for a certain level, like middle schools. So the types of initiatives varied in how many kids they would impact. So that's number one, important to know. Number two is the logical connection between that REAP and the metrics that we've outlined in the policy in the racial equity plan. So we can conduct REAPs that may not have a direct impact on some of the metrics. So, so we looked at both those things, how many schools it covered, and then the logical connection. Obviously, if it's a reading curriculum, that would connect to proficiency. But if it's, say, like an art curriculum, that may connect with reading proficiency, but that would be a distant connection, right? So, so that's what we're looking at here. So most of our impact level is still at the low level. We do have some that go into the high level. Some are none because they were not anything related to any of these metrics. So kind of our lesson learned at this point is, as we go forward to the next phase of this, is we want to have more REAPs covering more areas of the metrics and having a higher impact. I think what we have been doing is creating that fibrous culture that Vanessa and Dr. McPhail and Dr. Marshall talk about, which is making sure people understand the questions, the vocabulary, getting implicit bias training. There's a lot of foundations that have to happen as they're learning, as folks are learning to use the REAP. So that's the space we've been in. The next phase of this will be looking at implementation of practices and impact, and then building the dashboard for schools.
The next thing I want to talk to you all about are where you can find resources. So under the SBDM page that Dr. Shauna Stinton manages, you will find several videos, you'll find 3 examples, and you'll also find some other tools that are useful for training regarding the REAP for SBDM members. And then on DEP's website on the right-hand side, you'll find the REAP template, which has the 8 questions and the next step questions. You'll find the REAP best practice guide that I discussed. You'll find the REAP instructions for central office. And then lastly, there is a 5-minute brief video regarding the purpose of the REAP that you can view and share with your staff. Lastly, I want to leave you with my contact information. Feel free to call or email me if I can be of assistance to you and your school in regards to the REAP. Thank you.